The bread was still warm when I set it down, steam curling into the dim light of the kitchen. From the living room came my son's voice, bright, easy, careless. "Don't worry, she's just the nanny." The word just cracked like a stone on glass. I stood there, hands damp from washing, heat fading from the crust beneath my fingertips, and felt something colder than hurt settle in my chest. Not praise, not affection, a quiet dismissal. The first time I held him, his tiny fingers curled around mine like they were meant to anchor me to the earth. I remember the faint smell of milk on his skin, the way his breath fluttered against my collarbone. I was 27, unsure of so many things, but certain of this: he was the most important thing I would ever do. Our home then was modest, a narrow two-story with paint-chipped windows that rattled when the wind came in from the east. Out back, a lemon tree leaned against the fence, its branches heavy with fruit in the summer, stubbornly bare in the winter. I would hang sheets out to dry beneath it, the sharp scent of citrus mixing with the clean bite of soap. That was my world, small, perhaps, but full. My days revolved around him in those early years. Morning porridge sweetened with honey, reading together on the old floral couch, his head in my lap. Afternoons at the park where he'd run ahead, turning to make sure I was watching before he leapt from the low stone wall, arms outstretched like a bird. I never thought of what I gave up as sacrifices. I'd been offered a part-time teaching post at the local school once, but I turned it down without hesitation. It wasn't that I didn't value the work. It was that I valued this more. Being there when the bell rang, seeing his face light up as he spotted me in the crowd of parents. The pride in his voice when he'd tug at my sleeve to show me a drawing, a book he'd chosen from the library. My husband worked long hours even then, though in those days it felt like necessity, not avoidance. When he was home, he would scoop our boy into his arms, tossing him high until his laughter rang through the rooms. We would eat dinner together, simple meals, but made with care. I can still hear the sound of the wooden spoon scraping the bottom of the pot as I stirred my bean stew, the one my son would always ask for by name. It wasn't perfect, of course. The house was too small, the bills too many, the winter rains sometimes finding their way through the roof despite my husband's patchwork repairs. But there was warmth, the kind you can't buy. On summer nights after my son was asleep, I'd stand in the doorway of his room watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. I'd tuck the blanket under his chin, touch the hair curling damply at his temple. I would think, I must remember this exact moment, because even then, I knew childhood is like steam from a kettle. You see it, you feel it, and then it disappears. The lemon tree became our little ritual. In spring, we'd gather the blossoms in a chipped ceramic bowl, their scent filling the kitchen. By midsummer, we'd collect the ripe fruit, his small hands working awkwardly with the clippers. I'd slice them for lemonade, and he'd squeeze them with all his might, splashing juice on the counter. Sometimes, when money was tight, I'd sell jars of homemade lemon marmalade at the church fair. He'd sit beside me, proudly offering samples to strangers as though he were my partner in business. "It's my mom's," he'd tell them, and my heart would swell in my chest. Even when he grew older and more restless, I tried to keep those small traditions alive. In the early teen years, when conversations became shorter, I'd still make the stew on cold evenings, still hang the laundry under the lemon tree so he'd smell it when he came home. He didn't notice as much, or at least he didn't say so, but I told myself that deep down, he felt it. Looking back, I realize how much of myself I poured into the quiet details, the hand-sewn patches on his jeans shaped like stars and moons, the way I would slip a folded note into his lunchbox on exam days. "You've got this." The careful mending of his favorite red sweater even after it had more stitches than original fabric. Those years felt like a promise that if I gave him enough love, enough steadiness, he would always know where home was. I thought I was building something unshakable, like the roots of that old lemon tree, deep, interwoven with the soil of our lives. I didn't see the cracks forming then. I didn't hear the faint change in his tone when he'd say, "Mom," in front of his friends, as though the word embarrassed him. I didn't notice how the lemon tree's blossoms were fewer one spring, or that the laundry hung out to dry was ignored rather than inhaled. At the time, all I saw was my boy, taller now, voice deeper but still mine. And I believed, foolishly perhaps, that love alone was enough to keep him close. I was wrong, but those were still the good years. The years before I learned that the soil I'd tended so carefully could be turned under by someone else's hands. It started quietly, the way most endings do. Not with a slammed door or a shouted word, but with a chair left empty at the dinner table one night, then another, and another. At first, my husband's absences had explanations attached to them. Longer hours at the office, a new client requiring late meetings, a networking dinner that couldn't be missed. I believed him. I wanted to. After all, hadn't we both worked hard to keep this home, to give our son the life we never had? But explanations became shorter, vaguer. "Work," he'd say, already reaching for his coat. His phone buzzed more often and he would step outside to take the calls, his voice low and quick, the words carried away by the night air before I could catch them. When he was home, he seemed elsewhere, sitting at the table but not tasting his food, nodding at stories from our son without really hearing them. I would ask if something was wrong, and he'd smile, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and say, "You worry too much." It was around that time that he began commenting on standards. At first it was about the house, how it could be neater, how maybe we needed a more modern touch. Then it was about me, not unkindly at first, but enough to leave a mark. "Maybe you should get your hair done, it's been a while." Or, "You used to wear brighter colors, remember?" They were small things, easy to brush off in the moment, but they added up, each one another thread pulling loose in the fabric of our life. I noticed, too, that our son, still a teenager then, began to pick up some of that tone. He didn't mean it cruelly, but there was a faint echo of his father in the way he'd sigh when I reminded him about chores, or the way he'd say, yeah, I know," when I asked about homework. It wasn't rebellion so much as distance, a slow shift of orbit, as though I were the center of a system that was quietly losing its gravity. The winter I fell ill was when the first helper arrived. It was nothing serious, a bad flu that knocked me down for a couple of weeks, but my husband insisted we needed someone to keep things running. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair always tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Sophia. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that made me feel both grateful and oddly displaced. At first I told myself it was temporary, just until I was better. And she was helpful, making sure our son had lunch packed, keeping the laundry moving, even tending to the lemon tree in the yard. But I noticed how quickly both my husband and son grew accustomed to her presence, how they'd thank her for meals, compliment her organization, while my own efforts over the years had been met mostly with silence. When I was well enough to resume things, it was as though the space I'd left behind had already been filled. My husband suggested she stay on a few more weeks to help with spring cleaning. Those weeks stretched into months. Sophia was polite, careful not to step on my toes, but she was also present in ways I no longer seemed to be allowed to be. She sat in on conversations about the house repairs. She knew which groceries my son preferred before I could tell her. I began to notice how my husband's voice softened when he spoke to her, how he seemed almost lighter in her company. not in an overtly inappropriate way, but enough to stir a quiet unease in me. One evening, I overheard him telling her, "You've got such an eye for detail. It's refreshing." It was the sort of compliment I hadn't heard in years. I don't think he meant for me to hear it. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into every gesture. But there's a difference between paranoia and intuition, and I knew in my bones that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just that my husband was distant, it was that he had started building a world in which I was no longer essential. And my son, unknowingly, was learning to live in that world too. I began to feel like the lemon tree in late autumn, still rooted, still there, but stripped of fruit, its usefulness quietly overlooked. That winter, as frost settled on the yard, I watched my husband and son string lights on the tree without asking if I wanted to help. Sophia stood beside them, holding the box of bulbs. They laughed together at some shared joke I couldn't hear from the kitchen window. And I realized the distance wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. It didn't happen all at once. There was no day when Sophia announced she was taking over. It was more like a room filling with water. By the time I realized it was rising, it was already up to my neck. After that first winter, my husband didn't bother calling her temporary anymore. She had her own set of keys, a drawer in the kitchen for her things, and a mug with sunflowers painted on it that no one else used. I caught my son once reaching for it before stopping mid-motion, glancing toward the hall to make sure she wouldn't notice. I still tried to run the house as I always had, but gradually, tasks I'd done for decades slipped from my hands. I'd come into the kitchen to start dinner and find Sophia already at the stove, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled neatly, the smell of garlic and onions filling the air. My husband would pass through, sniff the pot and say, "Smells wonderful, Sophia," without even glancing at me. It wasn't that I begrudged her skill. She was good. Her meals were carefully plated, her pastries light and golden. But it was the way my husband praised her, as though excellence in that kitchen had been absent until she arrived. The change wasn't just in chores. It was in decisions. One day, I overheard my husband telling Sophia about his plans to replace the old couch. "Something more modern," he said. She agreed readily. I hadn't even known the couch was being replaced until it disappeared, replaced by a sleek gray thing that looked like it belonged in a showroom, not a home. When I asked about it, my husband smiled faintly and said, "We thought it was time for a change." We. I began to notice more and more we's that didn't include me. My son would come home from school and ask Sophia for help with his history project instead of me. She would sit with him at the dining table, their heads bent over the paper, her handwriting neat and slanted where mine was looping and soft. I'd hover in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in my own home. One afternoon, I came back from the market to find them all in the backyard. My husband fixing a loose board on the fence, my son holding it steady, and Sophia trimming the lemon tree. I set my basket down on the porch, watching them laugh together, my own name never once called. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that they weren't shutting me out intentionally. But then came the day I opened the pantry and found my jars of lemon marmalade pushed to the back, replaced in the front row by Sophia's version. Hers were labeled in tidy block letters, "Lemon Preserves, S." My labels, written in my mother's careful cursive years ago, were dusty and half hidden. I didn't say anything. Instead, I took one jar from the back, wiped the dust away, and put it in the center of the table that night. Nobody touched it. I suppose what hurt most wasn't Sophia herself. She never flaunted her place, never treated me with disrespect. If anything, she went out of her way to be polite. Too polite, the way you are with a neighbor you don't expect to see often. No. What hurt was how easily my husband and son accepted this rearrangement, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for me to fade into the background. The house began to feel different, brighter somehow, but not warmer. Sophia's neatness left no space for the lived-in clutter that had once made it ours. The stack of books by the sofa, the half-finished knitting on the armchair, the lemon rinds drying on the windowsill. My world was being smoothed over, polished, erased. I found myself spending more time in my sewing room, the one place Sophia never entered. I'd sit at the old Singer machine, the hum of the motor steady beneath my hands, and listen to the muffled sounds of their voices in the rest of the house. Sometimes I'd sew for hours without finishing anything, just to keep from walking into a room where I no longer belonged. The final shift came one Sunday afternoon. We were in the kitchen, Sophia at the counter, my husband pouring coffee, my son leaning against the doorframe. My husband turned to Sophia and asked, "What do you think about repainting the dining room?" She tilted her head, considering, and said, "Maybe something lighter. It would make the space feel more open." "That's what I was thinking," he replied, smiling. I looked at the pale yellow walls, the ones I'd chosen when my son was a toddler because they made the morning light feel warmer, and realized no one had asked me. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed. The lemon tree outside was bare, its branches rattling softly in the wind. I remembered the first time my son had helped me pick the fruit, his small hands struggling with the clippers, the juice sticky on his fingers. Back then, this had been our home, our world. Now it was just a place where I happened to live. And though I didn't know it yet, the next shift, the one that would cut deeper than all the rest, was already on its way. It began with the invitations, or rather, the lack of them. For years, I'd been the one to organize birthdays, holidays, and little get-togethers with family friends. I kept lists in my head: who preferred tea over coffee, which cousin always brought the dessert but forgot serving spoons. I knew these things the way I knew when the lemon tree would blossom. But one spring, I learned of a cousin's engagement party not from an invitation, but from a photo my sister sent me. My son was in the picture, standing beside Sophia. I wasn't there. When I asked about it later, he looked vaguely uncomfortable. "Oh, it was last minute," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I thought Dad told you." Dad had not. Another time, I overheard Sophia on the phone with my husband, confirming a dinner reservation for the three of them. Yes, she'll love that restaurant. I waited for my name to be mentioned. It wasn't. That night, I ate alone at the kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The real turning point came on my own birthday. I woke that morning to the smell of coffee and cinnamon, a rare treat. My heart lifted as I went to the kitchen, thinking they'd remembered. They had, but the celebration had already happened, in their own way. A small cake sat on the counter, already cut into. Sophia stood washing plates, my son and husband laughing over something on his phone. "Oh, we thought you were still asleep," my husband said. "We didn't want to wake you." I stood there, hands cold, the warmth of the moment passing me by like a train I hadn't been told to board. I took a small slice of cake and ate it at the end of the counter, pretending it didn't matter. Public moments began to shift too. We attended a neighbor's barbecue that summer. My husband, my son, Sophia, and me. I noticed I was seated at the far end of the table next to people I barely knew. My husband sat near the grill with Sophia, introducing her to the guests as a great help around the house. Later, when one of the men complimented the potato salad, my husband smiled and said, "Sophia's recipe." It wasn't. It was mine, unchanged for years. But it wasn't just the omissions. It was the tone. My husband began joking, at least he called it joking, that I loved to play house. He'd say it in front of people, his smile wide, as though my years of work were nothing more than an indulgent hobby. My son laughed along sometimes, not cruelly, but with the ease of someone who doesn't realize the weight of his laughter. That was when I began writing notes to myself, little scraps of paper tucked into the pages of cookbooks or pinned to the inside of my sewing room cabinet. You kept this home standing. You taught him to read. You matter. They weren't grand affirmations, just quiet reminders to hold on to the truth of my life before it was rewritten around me. One evening, after a particularly cold exchange at dinner, I went for a walk. The summer air was thick with the smell of jasmine from a neighbor's yard, but it didn't feel sweet to me. I walked without a destination, my feet carrying me past houses where lights glowed warmly in the windows. I wondered if anyone else inside those homes was feeling as invisible as I did. When I returned, I passed the kitchen and heard laughter. Sophia was showing my son something on her phone, her voice low but warm. My husband was leaning against the counter, smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. They didn't notice me at the doorway. I went upstairs without a word. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought of the lemon tree, how in its early years I'd pruned it carefully to keep it healthy. But lately, it had grown wild, branches twisting in directions I hadn't intended. The next morning, I clipped a single branch heavy with blossoms and placed it in a vase on the kitchen table. A small act, maybe even a defiant one. No one commented on it. By evening, the petals had begun to fall, scattering across the table like quiet truths no one wanted to pick up. Something in me knew then. This wasn't a phase. I was no longer simply part of the background. I was being moved off the stage entirely. If your own child began treating you like the hired help in your own home, how would you respond? It was a slow erasure, not in shouts or slammed doors, but in the quiet spaces where my voice used to fit. I first noticed it with the house repairs. The gutters had been sagging for years, and every winter I reminded my husband they needed fixing. Nothing was ever done. Then one morning, I came home from the market to find two men on ladders, replacing them. I stood there holding a bag of oranges while my husband and Sophia discussed payment schedules with the foreman. No one had told me they'd even called for a quote. The same thing happened with the curtains in the living room. I'd sewn those myself when my son was still in grade school. Pale green with tiny white flowers. They'd been there so long they felt like part of the room's bones. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find them gone, replaced by stark white drapes that fell in sharp lines. Sophia was smoothing the new fabric with her palms. "It brightens the space," she said gently, as though offering me consolation rather than explanation. I realized then, decisions were being made without me, not just occasionally, but as a rule. Sophia had her own house key now. My husband had pressed it into her hand one morning before I'd even had my coffee. I was standing at the sink, rinsing mugs, when he said, "It just makes sense. She's here more than anyone." The words caught in my throat before I could ask what he meant by anyone. Worse still, my son began consulting her before me. At first, it was about practical things. The best route to his friend's house, whether he could take the car. Then it was about schoolwork, weekend plans, even what to get his father for his birthday. One evening, I overheard him in the kitchen asking, "Do you think Mom would mind if—" But he didn't finish the question with me in the room. He finished it with Sophia later. The sewing room, once my quiet retreat, became the only place where my things stayed untouched. Even so, I overheard them one evening discussing how it could make a great guest room someday. Sophia's voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, but my husband's was sure. "It's wasted space," he said. That night, I stayed in there longer than usual, running my hands over the fabrics I'd collected over the years. Soft wools, crisp cottons, scraps from my mother's dresses. The air smelled faintly of lavender from a sachet I kept in the drawer. It was the last room in the house that still smelled like me. I began walking in the evenings, not for my health, but for escape. I would pass houses where I imagined the wives were inside making dinner, children calling from upstairs. I'd picture a table set for everyone, with no empty chair at the far end. One evening on my return, I paused in the driveway before going in. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, I saw my son leaning against the counter, Sophia beside him. They were laughing at something on her phone. My husband entered, brushed past her shoulder as he reached for the cupboard and poured himself a glass of wine. It was such a small, ordinary scene, the sort that happens in any home, but it felt like I was looking in on a family I didn't belong to. I thought of the lemon tree in the backyard, how its branches bent toward the fence now, reaching into the neighbor's yard. I wondered if one day all its fruit would fall on the other side, and I would be left staring at the bare limbs from my window. The exclusion wasn't always silent. Sometimes it was a closed door, like the afternoon I came home early to find my husband and Sophia in the dining room, going over what looked like receipts and floor plans. When I stepped in, the papers were quickly stacked, and the conversation changed. "Just house stuff," he said lightly, but his eyes flicked toward Sophia before meeting mine. Once I caught Sophia moving my mother's china teacups from the cabinet to a box in the garage. "They're safer here," she explained. I didn't argue, but later that night I brought them back inside and placed them on the top shelf, high enough that no one would touch them again. I don't know when the decision to walk away began forming inside me, but I suspect it was somewhere in these quiet exclusions. Not in a single moment of rage, but in the accumulation of small silences. One day, while folding laundry in the sewing room, I heard my son's voice drifting down the hall. Maybe we could turn it into a study after all. Sophia could use it. That was when I knew. It wasn't just my place in their lives that was shrinking. It was my place in my own home. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special, the sort of day that passes without leaving much of a mark, when the first real crack appeared. We had guests for dinner, old friends of my husband's from work. The kind of evening where wine flows freely and laughter grows louder as the plates empty. I had cooked most of the meal, though Sophia handled the dessert. Halfway through the night, my son, trying to impress, began telling a story about a camping trip from years ago. He got one small detail wrong, the year. Without thinking, I gently corrected him. "It was the summer before you turned 12, not after." The room went quiet for half a second, the way it does when a sound goes out of tune. My son smiled tightly, and in a voice that carried just enough for the table to hear, he said, "Mom, it doesn't matter. Sophia already helped me write it down for my scrapbook." The word Sophia hung in the air like a curtain drawn between us. A few people chuckled politely and turned back to their wine. I let the moment pass, my fork poised above my plate. Inside, something shifted. Not anger exactly, but a dull ache that settled somewhere deep. From then on, the moments multiplied. Small corrections. Suggestions that I let Sophia handle it. The first time I truly felt displaced was the afternoon I went to look for a brooch my mother had given me, a silver one shaped like a swallow in flight. I found it, not in the small velvet box where I kept it, but on Sophia's dresser. It wasn't displayed, just resting there as though she'd taken it off before bed. I held it in my palm for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight. My mother had worn it on her coat every winter until she gave it to me. Sophia came in while I was still standing there. "Oh, I meant to ask you about that," she said quickly. "It was in the sewing room drawer, and I thought it was loose change or something. I didn't realize—" Her voice trailed off when she saw my face. I didn't scold her. I didn't accuse her. I just placed the brooch back in the box that night and slid it into the locked trunk at the foot of my bed. The house began to feel less like mine in other, subtler ways. My husband started consulting Sophia about grocery lists. My son began telling her about his day before telling me, sometimes instead of telling me at all. One evening, I came into the kitchen to find the three of them around the table, talking over renovation plans. Sophia was sketching something on a piece of paper, her handwriting tidy and slanted. My son leaned in, making suggestions. My husband nodded in approval. When they noticed me, my husband said, "We're thinking of redoing the dining room. Sophia had some great ideas. Not you and I, not even we, just Sophia." I began keeping to myself more, not out of sulking but out of self-preservation. The sewing room became my sanctuary, though even there I felt the pressure of encroaching plans. I started locking the door when I wasn't inside. Once, while in the yard pruning the lemon tree, I overheard my son and Sophia in the kitchen. He was laughing, telling her about a teacher from school who reminded him of her. "She's always so put together," he said. "Not like—" His voice dropped lower then, and I didn't catch the rest. But I didn't need to. I knew the shape of the words that had followed. It's strange. The first real signs of betrayal don't arrive like lightning. They seep in, soft and slow, until one day you realize you're standing in a house full of shadows. The final moment in this slow parade came on a Sunday morning. I had risen early, determined to make pancakes the way I used to when my son was small. The batter was ready, the pan heating on the stove, when Sophia came in. She glanced at the counter and said, "Oh, I was going to make those. He likes them with blueberries now." It was a simple sentence, a harmless one even, but it carried the weight of years, of the subtle rewriting of history, of my son's shifting tastes and loyalties, of a home that had moved on without me. I let her take over the stove. I stood at the sink, rinsing blueberries under cold water, and realized I was no longer cooking for my family. I was watching someone else do it. That night, as I locked my sewing room door, I thought again of the brooch, of my mother's hands fastening it to my coat the winter after she gave it to me. And I understood. The brooch was more than a keepsake. It was proof of something passed down, something I wasn't ready to hand over just yet, but soon I would. Only not to the ones who expected it. It was a warm afternoon in early autumn, the kind where sunlight filters through the lemon tree in thin, golden threads. My son's fiancée, a sweet-faced young woman named Claire, was visiting for the first time, and my husband insisted on a small gathering to introduce her to the family. I baked bread that morning, the way my mother used to before guests arrived. The scent filled the kitchen, mingling with the slow simmer of stew on the stove. I didn't mind the extra work. In my mind, this was still my role, the quiet architect of comfort. By mid-afternoon, the living room was full. My husband poured wine, Sophia moved easily among the guests. My son sat with Claire on the couch, telling stories about his childhood. I stood near the doorway, listening as he spoke. He was laughing, his voice warm with nostalgia. Someone, I think it was Claire, asked about the house. "Oh, this place?" my son said, glancing toward Sophia with a grin. "Sophia keeps everything running. Mom's just the nanny around here." The words landed like a fist to the chest. Not the nanny, but just the nanny. The room chuckled politely, taking it as harmless banter. Claire smiled, perhaps thinking it was some inside joke, but I heard the truth in it. Not anger, not cruelty. Worse than that. Dismissal. I smiled faintly, the way you do when someone mistakes you for something you aren't and you have no wish to correct them in public. I excused myself quietly, no one noticing, and walked through the sliding glass door into the backyard. The lemon tree stood there, branches heavy with fruit that had ripened early this year. I rested my hand against its trunk, feeling the rough bark under my palm. I thought of the afternoons when my son and I had picked these lemons together, juice sticky on our fingers, laughter caught in the air. Inside, I could hear them still, voices rising and falling, the clink of glasses, Sophia's light laugh. I stayed in the garden until the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long. A single lemon fell from a branch above me, landing in the grass with a dull thud. I bent to pick it up, turning it over in my hands. Its skin was warm from the sun, its scent sharp and familiar. That night, after the guests left, I washed the dishes in silence. My son came into the kitchen to say goodnight, leaning against the counter as though the day had been nothing more than pleasant. "Claire really likes Sophia," he said with a smile. I nodded. "Of course she does." He didn't hear the layers in my voice, or maybe he did and chose not to. Later, lying in bed beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling in the dark. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the creak of a branch against the window, and underneath it all, the echo of my son's voice, just the nanny. That was the moment the seed was planted, not of revenge, not yet, but of clarity. I saw, as plainly as I saw the moonlight on the bedroom wall, the shape of my place in this house, ornamental at best, invisible at worst. And I knew then, something would have to change. If the child you raised called you just the nanny, would you forgive them or walk away? The morning after he called me just the nanny, the house felt different. Not in its walls or its light, those were the same, but in the way the air sat heavy, as though it had absorbed my silence from the night before. I made coffee, poured it into my oldest mug, the one with the fading blue rim, and sat at the kitchen table long after the cup was empty. My husband left without a word beyond the rustle of his coat. My son slept late. Sophia hummed softly upstairs as she tidied, a sound I had once found comforting but now felt like it was claiming the house's heartbeat. After breakfast, I went to the sewing room and opened the old cedar trunk at the foot of the wall. Inside were the things I'd kept for decades: my father's letters, my mother's silver brooch, photographs of my son when his hands were still small enough to disappear into mine. Beneath those, wrapped in a cloth worn thin with age, was the deed to the house. It was the first time I'd touched it in years. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and ink, as though time itself had seeped into its fibers. I traced my name where it sat in black ink, steady and certain. It occurred to me then how many decisions about this house had been made without me, and how little they realized whose name truly mattered. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. The number came from a folded flyer I'd kept in the drawer, just in case. We agreed to meet later that week. I told no one. When Sophia asked if I wanted dinner started early, I smiled and said I might go for a walk instead. Those walks became my alibi. Each morning I left with a scarf around my neck and a tote bag slung over my shoulder as though I were headed to the market. In truth, I walked to the lawyer's small office above the bakery 2 streets over. The smell of fresh bread would follow me up the stairs, a quiet comfort in the midst of colder business. We spoke plainly. I told him I wanted my affairs in order. I wanted the house to be protected, not for my husband, not for my son, but for someone who would value it. His eyebrows lifted slightly at that, but he didn't question me. He took notes, asked for documents, explained the steps. At home, I moved carefully. I began sorting through belongings, not in a way that would alarm anyone, but in small acts, donating clothes I no longer wore, placing certain objects into boxes labeled for storage. It was strange how light those actions made me feel, like pruning a tree so it could grow in the right direction. I found myself talking to Sophia more during this time, not about the plan, not yet, but about her life. She told me about her mother in the Philippines, how she sent money home each month for medicine and school fees for her younger siblings. Her eyes softened when she spoke of them, her voice carrying a quiet longing I recognized from my own early years of motherhood. She had never asked to replace me here. That much was clear. The roles had been given to her by those who found it convenient to push me aside. She'd stepped into them because she knew no other way to keep her place. One evening, after my son left with friends and my husband retreated to his office, Sophia and I sat in the kitchen peeling lemons for preserves. The air smelled sharp and clean, the peels curling like ribbons on the counter. She thanked me for teaching her my recipe. I didn't tell her then that I was planning to leave her far more than a recipe. Each day I grew more certain. I began keeping copies of important papers in a folder in my sewing room, alongside a list of instructions written in my neatest hand. The lawyer assured me everything was in motion, that with a few more signatures, the house would be secure in the hands I chose. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. No boiling rage, no tearful outbursts, just a steady, deliberate quiet. I think that's the part my husband and son misunderstood most about me. They thought my silence meant surrender, when in truth it was the sound of me gathering strength. One afternoon I returned from the lawyer's office to find my son and Sophia in the garden, pruning the lemon tree together. He was explaining how to angle the clippers, the same way I'd taught him years ago. I stood at the kitchen window, watching, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel excluded. I felt ahead, because I knew something they didn't. The next chapter of this house's story was already being written, and they weren't holding the pen. I began spending more time with Sophia, not out of necessity, but out of quiet intention. It started small, an extra cup of tea poured in the late afternoons, a seat offered at the kitchen table when she might otherwise be bustling at the counter. At first, she seemed unsure of the shift, as though waiting for the catch, but there was none. One rainy afternoon I invited her into the sewing room. She hesitated in the doorway, glancing around at the shelves of neatly folded fabric, the wooden spools lined like soldiers, the faint smell of lavender that always lingered here. "This is your space," she said softly, as though she knew what it meant for me to open it. "It's ours today," I replied, sliding the chair beside mine toward her. We spent the next hour repairing one of my husband's shirts, a small tear in the cuff. As we worked, she told me about her life before this house. She spoke of the narrow streets of her childhood town, the market stalls crowded with fruit, the heat that clung to the skin like a second layer. She described her mother's small kitchen, where the walls were stained with the steam of years of cooking, and the laughter of siblings crowded around the table. I learned she had studied nursing before coming here, but the money she sent home was more important than the diploma. Her eyes dimmed when she mentioned her mother's health, then brightened again when she spoke of the care packages she sent, tins of biscuits, school books, photographs of the garden here. Over the following weeks, we found small rhythms together. She would join me in the garden to prune the lemon tree, our hands brushing as we passed the clippers. I showed her how to tell when the fruit was ready, not by color alone, but by the weight of it in the palm. She began to use my mother's old preserving jars without asking, but always washed and returned them to their place with care. I think she began to understand that my kindness was deliberate, not accidental. And slowly, I began to see her not as the one who had taken my place, but as someone who had been handed it without consent. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I tested the first step of my plan. We were sitting at the table peeling lemons, the sunlight catching the thin curls of rind. "You know," I said, "when I'm gone one day, I hope someone will keep this house the way it's meant to be kept, not just clean, lived in." Her hand stilled for a moment, but she didn't look up. "I think that's why people love it here," she said. It feels like it has a soul, I smiled. And some souls deserve the right guardian. I didn't push further. The seed was planted. The next week I began giving her small things. A set of linen napkins I'd sewn years ago, a ceramic mixing bowl from my mother's kitchen. She protested at first. "These are yours," she said. "They're meant to be used," I told her, "and you'll use them." Each gift was practical but chosen with care, objects that carried history but also function. I could see her puzzling over why I was giving them to her. She didn't ask directly, and I didn't explain. My husband and son remained oblivious. They saw my time with Sophia as proof I'd finally accepted her role here. My son even joked one evening, "Good thing you two get along, makes the house run smoother." I let him think that. What neither of them noticed was that in those afternoons, over tea and quiet conversation, I was shaping the future of this home in ways they couldn't undo. One particularly cold morning, I came into the kitchen to find Sophia staring at an envelope in her hands. The postmark was from her home country. She opened it carefully, and I saw her shoulders stiffen as she read. "It's my mother," she said after a pause. "She needs an operation. It's a lot of money." I poured her tea without asking. "You'll manage it," I said simply. "You've done harder things." She smiled faintly but didn't reply. I didn't offer her money, not then. But I made a note in my mind. If my plan worked as it should, she would never again have to choose between keeping this house and caring for her family. By late winter, the trust between us had grown into something quiet but steady. She began coming to me with her small dilemmas, whether to plant herbs in the garden or buy them fresh, which preserves to make for the church fair, how to deal with the neighbor's cat that kept curling up on the porch cushions. They were small things, but they mattered. They meant she saw me not as someone being replaced, but as someone to learn from. And though I never said it out loud, each time she came to me I thought, "You are the one who will tend this place when I am gone." By the time early spring came, the plan was no longer an idea. It was a living thing, growing roots beneath the floorboards of the house. I had met with the lawyer 3 more times, each visit disguised as a morning walk to the market. He was thorough, the sort who preferred every I dotted twice, every T crossed like a gate no one could force open. We went over the deed, the will, and a transfer document that would leave no room for contest. My signature flowed steadily across each page, the ink sinking in like water to dry soil. From that point on, the house's fate was sealed. At home, I moved as though nothing had changed. I cooked when asked, cleaned in the corners they forgot about, stayed silent during the endless small decisions they made without me. But in my mind, every plate I washed, every lemon I picked, every drawer I closed was done with the knowledge that these walls would soon belong to someone who valued them. I began giving Sophia more of my things. A small wooden rolling pin I'd used since my first year of marriage, the set of enamel bowls my mother had passed down. She tried to refuse at first, the way she always did. "They'll be yours one day," I told her. "Better to have them now, while I can still tell you their stories." Sometimes she'd listen quietly as I spoke of how my mother used those bowls to make bread on cold mornings, or how the rolling pin had once belonged to a bakery in my old neighborhood. Other times she'd simply nod, her hands tracing the worn edges as though memorizing them. I cleared the sewing room bit by bit. My fabrics went into a cedar chest, my sewing machine covered in a cloth I stitched myself decades ago. One evening my son noticed the room looked sparser. "Finally getting rid of that old stuff?" he asked casually. "Just making space," I replied. He didn't ask for what or for whom. In the kitchen, I noticed him and my husband speaking more to Sophia than to me about meals and schedules. I let it happen. They believed I had given up, that I had finally settled into my nanny role. It suited me to let them think so. The lawyer called one afternoon to confirm that all the papers were signed and filed. "It's done," he said simply. "No one can touch it now." That night I made lemon marmalade. Sophia helped me, the scent of citrus filling the air, steam clouding the kitchen windows. We worked in silence until she asked, "Why do you always give me the first jar?" I dried my hands on a tea towel and met her eyes. "Because you appreciate it," I said. "That's all that matters." She didn't press, but I saw the flicker of understanding there. A faint light, not yet a flame. Meanwhile, I took small measures to protect what I could. I locked my personal letters and photographs in the trunk in my bedroom. I made a list of instructions for the garden: when to prune, how to feed the soil, how to keep the lemon tree from leaning too far toward the fence. I wrote it as if it were for anyone, but I knew exactly whose hands would one day hold it. Each action felt like tucking away a secret piece of myself for safekeeping. I wasn't just leaving Sophia the house, I was leaving her its soul. By mid-March, the family, my husband, my son, and even Sophia, were deep in preparations for my son's engagement party. I stayed on the edges, watching, quietly noting the ways they arranged the house without asking my opinion. It didn't bother me anymore. If anything, it made my decision feel cleaner, sharper. One evening, while they discussed seating arrangements in the dining room, I stepped outside into the garden. The lemon tree had begun to blossom again, white flowers dotting the branches like small stars. I stood there a long while, breathing in their scent. The petals were so light, a passing breeze could send them drifting to the grass. But for now, they clung tight. The next morning, I clipped a single branch and placed it in a vase on the kitchen table. Sophia noticed it first. "It's beautiful," she said softly. I smiled. "It's a reminder," I told her. "Of what?" "That roots matter more than branches." She tilted her head, clearly unsure of my meaning, but I didn't explain. Not yet. The foundation of my plan was laid. All that remained now was timing and patience. If you had the power to leave everything to someone other than your ungrateful family, would you take it? It was early April when my body finally reminded me of my age. It began as a dull ache in my chest, the kind you mistake for fatigue or poor sleep. I ignored it for a few days. There was always something else to do, until one morning I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, unable to catch my breath after carrying a basket of laundry upstairs. My husband was in his office. My son had already left for the day. It was Sophia who noticed. She was pouring tea when she saw me pressing a hand to my chest. "Sit. Don't move," she said sharply, the authority in her voice cutting through the quiet. She drove me to the clinic herself. The doctor said it was nothing urgent, a warning really. Stress and age conspiring together. "You'll need rest," he told me, "and less strain." Rest. The word sounded both like a kindness and a verdict. When we came home, Sophia insisted I lie down. My husband barely looked up from his desk when she told him what happened. "Good thing you were here," he said to her, "not me." My son, when he returned, simply asked if I was feeling better now before disappearing into his room. It was in that moment, watching them treat my fragility as just another household inconvenience, that I knew my timing had to change. I had planned to wait until after the engagement party to make my move. Now I understood. The less they relied on me, the cleaner my exit would be. Over the next week, I tested my absence. I didn't cook. Sophia filled the gap without hesitation. I didn't tend the laundry. My husband learned where the iron was kept. My son asked Sophia to mend a loose button on his shirt, a task I could have done in minutes, and she did it without comment. I could feel myself vanishing from the daily workings of the house, and no one protested. That stung, but it also told me what I needed to know. My departure would cause barely a ripple. One morning, when the others had left, I walked to the lawyer's office for the final meeting. The documents were ready. The house, upon my passing, would be left entirely to Sophia. There were contingencies, of course, protections against legal challenges. I initialed every page, my signature steady despite the tremor in my fingers. "You're certain about this?" the lawyer asked, not unkindly. "Yes," I said. "I'm more certain about this than I've been about anything in years." When I returned home, the lemon tree was in full bloom. The scent was almost too much, heavy in the warm air. I stood beneath its branches, letting the petals fall into my hair. I thought about how long it had stood here, season after season, even when no one tended it properly. Strength in stillness. That evening I began quietly packing a few small bags, nothing that would be missed right away. My sewing scissors wrapped in cloth, the cedar box of my mother's letters, the photograph of my son at 3 years old holding a lemon twice the size of his hand. I didn't plan to leave immediately. There was still one thing I wanted, for them to see my decision, to hear it, and to understand, even if only for a moment, that they had written me out of this home long before I chose to walk away. The opportunity came sooner than expected. My son announced he wanted to have a small pre-engagement dinner the following week. "Just family," he said. But I knew his definition of family now, and I also knew it would be the perfect stage. I slept better that night than I had in months, not because I felt vindicated. I didn't. The truth was gentler, quieter. I felt ready. The night of the dinner was warm enough to leave the windows open. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the oven, mingling with the faint sweetness of the lemon blossoms outside. I wore a navy dress I hadn't taken out in years, simple, but with a weight to it, as though it remembered better days. My son arrived first with Claire, his fiancée, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. Sophia had been in the kitchen since late afternoon, her quiet efficiency filling the air with a sense of order. My husband emerged from his office just as the guests were taking their seats. We gathered around the table, my husband at the head, my son and Claire beside him, Sophia between them and me. Conversation was light, full of the usual small talk about wedding plans and the weather. I listened, smiling faintly, adding a word here and there. It wasn't until dessert, lemon tart, Sophia's doing, that my son stood to make his announcement. "I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began. "Claire and well, we feel lucky to be surrounded by family who've supported us so much." He glanced at his father, then at Sophia, who blushed and looked down at her plate. "And Sophia, you've been such a huge part of keeping this house running. I don't know what we'd do without you." I set down my fork carefully. "You might be surprised," I said softly. The table quieted. All eyes turned toward me. I let the silence breathe for a moment before I spoke again. "Since we're all here, there's something I'd like to say." My husband shifted in his chair. "Is this really—" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "This is exactly the time." I folded my hands on the table. "I've lived in this house for more than 30 years. I've watched it grow, change, weather storms, inside and out. And I've thought a great deal about what will happen to it when I'm gone." My son's brow furrowed slightly, as though he already sensed the shape of what was coming but couldn't quite believe it. "I've made arrangements," I continued. "The house will belong to Sophia." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one spoke at first. Claire's eyes widened. My husband's jaw tightened. My son looked from me to Sophia as though waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a joke. "That's not—" he began, but I raised a hand. "It is," I said. "The papers are signed. It's done." Sophia's face had gone pale. I don't understand," she said. "You don't have to," I replied gently. Just know that you've cared for this home as if it were your own. And now, one day, it will be." My husband leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp. "You can't just—" "I can," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "My name is on the deed. It always has been. You just forgot." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. My son's lips pressed into a thin line. "Why her?" he asked finally, the words edged with something between confusion and hurt. I met his gaze without flinching. "Because she respects what this house is. Because she understands that keeping it is about more than walls and a roof. And because she's never once made me feel like I didn't belong here." His face flushed, but he didn't speak again. I stood then, smoothing the skirt of my dress. "I'll be moving out in a few days," I said. "The house is in good hands now." No one moved as I left the table. In the kitchen, I paused for a moment, listening to the muted voices behind me. Sophia followed a minute later, still pale. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "I know," I said. "That's why you deserve it." We stood there for a long moment, the scent of lemon and sugar heavy in the air, the murmur of voices from the dining room fading into the background, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of stillness that comes not from being ignored, but from having the last word. If you were in my place, would you tell them why, or leave them to wonder forever? I live by the sea now. The first morning in the cottage, I woke to the sound of gulls and the slow, measured breath of waves against the shore. The air here tastes of salt, sharp and clean, and the wind carries the scent of pine from the hills behind. I keep the windows open most days, letting the ocean speak to me in its patient, endless way. The cottage is small, 2 rooms and a porch that looks west. But it is mine. My sewing machine sits by the window, the cedar box with my mother's letters tucked beneath the table. A bowl of lemons rests on the counter, though they come from the market now, not the tree. Still, their brightness feels like a piece of home I brought with me. Sophia writes often. She sends photographs of the garden, the lemon tree heavy with fruit, the kitchen lit by afternoon sun. She says she's kept the curtains I made, though the rest of the house has changed in small ways. I can see in her words that she tends the place with care, not out of obligation, but out of love. My son wrote once, a short letter, polite, awkward, circling around the thing he couldn't quite say. I read it twice before folding it away. I don't need his apology to know I made the right choice. Some evenings I walk along the shore until the light fades, my footprints vanishing behind me as the tide comes in. I think about the years I spent in that house, the seasons marked by the bloom and fruit of the lemon tree. I think about the long silence I kept, the one they mistook for weakness. And then I think about the moment I placed the future in the right hands, and how light I felt walking away. On the porch, I keep a single lemon in a small clay dish. It's not for cooking, not for show. It's there to remind me that some things you plant for yourself, and some things you leave for others. But both, if tended well, will last long after you're gone.